Christy, welcome back to my channel and welcome to day 6 of my 2020 Valentine card series. Today I'm going to be revisiting one of my favorite stamp sets of all time. It is the Mama Elephant Up, Up, and Away, and I will be combining that with Everyday Greetings. So I stamped out the images I'll be using with Memento Tuxedo Black on some Nina Solar White cardstock. And I'm going to start with my little fox. I'm coloring with my Copics today, and for him I'm using E70, E71, and E74. For the color palette that I'm going for today, an orange fox just wasn't going to work, so I decided to either make him a gray fox, or he could also even be just a little wolf, whatever, the recipient wants to interpret him as. So I'm going for a little bit of a softer look on today's card. So I'm keeping my shadows relatively small. So I laid those in with the E74, and then I'm pulling those out with the E71, and then I'm going to come in with that E70 as my highlight and just fill in the rest of his fur. I am leaving a little bit of a white tip on his tail. I just thought that would be a cute detail. And for the white parts, I'm going to use E40 and combine that with just a little bit of the Colorless Blender to soften that into the white areas. So just to add a little bit of shading, like I said, I'm trying to go a little bit softer today and just add a slight bit of color and then soften it with the Colorless Blender. For the bunny, I'm using C0, C1, and C3. And I'm going to start shading with that C3 on his right hand side. I'm shading these critters today in the direction that they're facing so that the light is hitting them in the face and their shadows are toward the back of their bodies. So since the bunny is facing left, his shadows are going to fall a little bit more on the right hand side, but still have a little bit on the left to just lift him off the page and give him that nice rounded three-dimensional appearance. So once I have my shadows laid in, I'll come in with my mid-tone, that C1, and go over the edge of that, still leaving a lot of room for that highlighted shade, the C0. Like I said earlier, I want to have a little bit of a lighter look today, so I'm not using quite as much contrast as I typically do. I normally like to have quite a bit, but today I just wanted to try this different look and see how it goes. I did have to add in a little bit because it was just too flat for me. So I did go back and add a little bit more darkness, but I kept it really just sparing. And for his white areas, I just added a little bit of that C0 and then blended out the edge of it with the Colorless Blender into the white. I added in some rosy cheeks with the RV11 just to help them look extra cheerful. So I did both of the critters, and I also colored in their noses with this shade as well, just to give them that extra little pop of pink. Then I'm going to move on to my balloons, and the first color combo that I'm using is R000, R11, and R20. And I'm going to color at least 2 to 3 balloons in each of the clusters with these shades. I will only show the one on the right that's, facing in the correct direction on screen, and the other ones I will color off screen just to save some time. But I'm starting with that R20 as my shadow and then blending to the left with the R11 and then finishing with that R000, which is going to keep everything really pale and luminous. I just love this combination. This was the first time I think I've used these, and I really fell in love with it. So then I'm going to progress just a step up. I'm going to remove the R000, keep the R11 and R20, and add in the R22. So it's going to be very much in keeping with the color palette that I've already started, but just a step up. And it's going to give it almost kind of an ombre effect for some of these balloons because they're going to just be shades of the same kind of colors. So I'm once again using that R22 as my darkest and then blending up with the R20 and finishing with the R11 now. And then I'm going to move on to my next color combo, remove the R11 just as I did before, remove the palest color, and now the R20 becomes my lightest shade. The R22 is going to be my mid-tone, and I'm adding in the R24 as my darkest. So now you can kind of see what I'm talking about with that ombre effect, just having those really similar shades, and I think it's really effective. I absolutely love the way this card turned out. I think it's one of my favorites in a while. It just has a really dreamy quality to it, I feel like. So this could also work for a birthday card or pretty much any occasion if you just changed up the color palette. So I'm just going to finish up these red balloons, and I am shading in the bottom right of each balloon just to keep things really consistent, and then blending up toward the top left. I wanted to introduce another color in the mix to kind of break up the pink a bit, just so it wasn't so one note. So I decided to go with purple, and for that combo I'm using V20, V22, and V25. So I'm starting with the V25 as my shadow, blending up with the V22, and then finishing with the V20. And I did go back and add a double layer of the darkest two shades just to add a bit more contrast, because these colors do blend together very well. So I just wanted to beef that up a bit and give it the same amount of shadow as those red balloons had. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the purple, just in the reverse. This time I took away the darkest shade, and instead I'm going to add in a little bit of the colorless blender. So right now I was just kind of playing to see what color hue I could get. I wanted it to be super, super light and kind of fade into white, just have the hint of purple. So I did go back and forth a little bit with that V22 and V20 and softened it into the white as the highlight. So I'll just finish up this last balloon here, and then I'm going to trim all of these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm taking some Ranger Distress Oxide ink in Shaded Lilac, and I'm using the My Favorite Things Cloud Stencil to transfer that ink onto a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock. That's my favorite cardstock for ink blending. Now I want a quite soft look, so I am going to just keep making sure that I don't get any kind of harsh marks on there. I'm going to use a very soft hand as I'm blending, and I'm also going to keep turning that stencil as I go down the page, just so I get a little bit of a different cloud look. I'm also going to do kind of an ombre effect by getting just the slightest bit darker as I go down the panel. So as I go, I'm just going to press a little bit harder. I'm still using very little pressure, but I just wanted to add a little bit of a darker color down towards the bottom just to differentiate it a little bit. And then I'll blend some more ink right at the top corners just to help them stand out. Then I'll pop this panel into my MISTI, and I'm going to stamp out my sentiment and one of the sets of balloons with some Memento Tuxedo Black ink, which is the same ink that I used for stamping my images earlier. And the sentiment says, "Spread in a little love." The die that comes with the stamp set does not cut out the strings, so you do have to stamp those onto your panel if you want them to show. So I used the images there that I had already die cut to make sure that I lined up the second cluster of balloons in the right place, so I can stamp that down. And I did have a little mistake happen here. Because that is the Bristol Smooth Surface, the ink smears really easily on there. You have to be careful, and it did smear my sentiment a little bit, so I decided to die cut a piece of that same cardstock, the Bristol Smooth, with the Lawn Fawn Stitch Cloud border. And this time I'm stamping out my sentiment in VersaFine Onyx Black ink. This would also smear if you touched it on this cardstock, so you have to be very careful. But that will cover up that little boo-boo and no one will ever know the difference. and it'll also just give me another little bit of dimension and that stitching detail on the card. So wasn't a big deal. I was glad it was the sentiment and not the balloon strings, or I would have had to do that cloud panel all over again. So then I'm going to pop in my card base so I can finish off the inside of the card as well. And I'm using MFT's Grapesicle cardstock and Lawn Fawn's Juice Box ink. And I'm stamping out the little monkey and the sentiment that says, "Live every moment, love every day, love beyond words." And I'm going to mask off the little monkey's hand with just a little piece of post-it tape so that I can stamp the balloon cluster and make it look like he's holding onto those strings. So that will just cover up his hand a little bit. And it did pick up the mask, but that was fine. I just inked right over it and then peeled it off of the stamp so it still has the same effect. And I also stamped out the little tail that is a separate image in that set while I was at it. So now I'm going to take a little heart image from the Goodreads stamp set, and I'm going to stamp that down in some Ballet Slippers ink from Lawn Fawn. It's a very pale pink. Right now I am just stamping it out a few times at the bottom where it's going to be covered up by that cloud border, just to make sure that I was getting a consistent ink up on that stamp so that there weren't kind of like little spots in it, since it was a stamp that I had never used before. I wanted to be sure that it would take the ink very well. So I just stamped it off down there rather than on a scratch piece of paper, since it would be covered up anyway. So now I'm going to adhere this to my card, and I'm just trying to figure out if I wanted that purple border on one side or both sides. I trimmed that down just a little bit so some of that cardstock could show through. And I ended up going with having the purple on both sides. So I'm going to adhere that down, and then the card wasn't perfectly cut on there, so I am going to just take my scissors and trim off that little bit of excess at the bottom of the card, just so it's nice and flush and looks, you know, professional. Then I can grab that cloud border, which I have trimmed down to the same size as the white panel, and I've added some foam tape to the back of that, so I'm going to pop that up on the card, just lining it up with the bottom of that card base. I've added some foam tape to the back of my images so I can peel off the release papers and line those up. I'm starting with those balloons just to make sure that they are perfectly in place. So I'm just lining those up with the matching strings, and that was pretty easy to do. And then I can grab my two little critters, and I'm going to adhere those so that they look like they're just hanging on from the bottom. The little wolf or fox is going to overlap the cloud border, which is also raised. So I just added a bit of foam tape to his hand, which will be over that cloud border. And then I actually realized that he needed a little bit on the back of his head as well, since that would stick up in order to have him in the right position. So I just added a little piece there and then use liquid glue for the rest of him. So I'll just put him down into place. And then to finish up the card, I decided to add just a few of these tiny little iridescent stars. I was going to add hearts. I was sure that I had some, but when I went to my stash, it turned out that I didn't. All I had were these little stars. So I just thought that they would be cute anyway, and they would add a subtle bit of sparkle that wouldn't be too obtrusive or add like another color on there. So I'm going to just dot on my glue onto the panel, and then I can pick those up with my pick-me-up tool and just set them in place into the glue. And I didn't want to overload it either. I just added maybe 7 or 8 of these, and they're super, super tiny, and you know, they almost fade into the background except when you tip them into the light. And that is going to complete my card for today. I'll lift that up so you can see all the detail and that subtle sparkle, and also give you another peek at the inside. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this is one of my all-time favorite stamp sets, and I would love to hear from you guys what your all-time favorite stamp set is. So if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Also, you can ring that notification bell if you want to be sure that my videos always end up in your feed. If you'd like to keep on watching, here are 2 extra Valentine videos from previous years that I thought you might also enjoy. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.